Hey guys, Cecil here once again. Hey, I wanted to do a quick video today and talk to you about something that's kind of been on my mind the last several months, a topic I've really wanted to talk about and do a video on, and that is why the current generation of consoles, the 8th generation, specifically the PlayStation 4 and the Xbox One, why they're considered weaker in hardware compared to past console generations. Now, ever since the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One were announced and what their specs would mainly be, industry analysts, gamers have looked at those compared to where PC tech was at the time and said this batch of new boxes is weaker than past consoles compared to where PC tech was at the time. There's actually a really good graph. I'll see if I can find it online and I'll link it in the description below, where you'll kind of see the upward curve of PC power compared to where consoles have been, and it's actually a really good, very layman's explanation of where PC versus console was. But I'm going to sit here and I'll be the first one to fully admit I'm not going to pretend to be some major PC tech expert. I have a very basic understanding of it. This is going to be kind of admittedly a novice's view on console gaming in general and where the power of these systems has been and where it's going and where it is now. But I think once you listen to my explanation and, understand why the things are probably the way they are now, you'll kind of maybe see from where I'm coming from why the PS4 and the Xbox One are the way they are now. So basically, to kind of get an idea of why things are the way they are now, you kind of got to look back in the 80s and 90s, especially back during the 3rd and 4th generation of systems, the 8-bit and the 16-bit. Those consoles were primarily 2D, and PC tech didn't really have to advance really, really far and upgrade in power in order to keep up with PCs at the time. You could have incremental increases since it was still mainly focused on 2D. Jumping from 8 to 16-bit, the graphics got better. With the Super Nintendo specifically, the FX chip allowed the Super Nintendo to do very basic 3D. And the VRC chip for the Genesis in Virtua Racing allowed the Genesis to do very basic, 3D. But at the end of the day, both the 8 and 16-bit boxes were mainly 2D systems. So the cost wasn't going to be very high, especially with PC tech. Slow, small increments, it wouldn't have been very expensive back in the day. It really was the time when you start looking at the 5th generation of where things started to shape the way they are now, and that was mainly the jump to 3D. Because 3D chips back in the mid-90s were very expensive. Before the PlayStation 1, the Saturn, and the N64 came out, the 3DO had very basic 3D in it. It was a very expensive console, and even the PlayStation 4 and Saturn were not very cheap. They were actually sold less than what it cost to make them. And that's where, especially the 5th and 6th gen consoles were manufactured to the point where they would sell at a loss, but the software sales would make up the difference of the cost. So they might not make a ton of money on them right away, but as time wore on in the generation of that specific console, they would basically come down in cost, and they would eventually go from losing money on the hardware to making money on the hardware. The Saturn especially, that got cut from $399 to $199 within 12 to 18 months of the Saturn's launch, and it was a very expensive console to manufacture, and Sega lost a ton of money during that 5th generation, and why they kind of ended up the way they did with the Dreamcast and not being able to make an extended effort with the Dreamcast. The PlayStation 2 is another good example. Having a DVD drive in there, the PS2 when it launched at $299, Sony was selling the console at a loss, but they were selling so much software, especially within the first couple of years of the system's life, that they were making up for those losses, and the PlayStation 2, at least for them specifically, ended up being a very, very profitable generation for them. Nintendo with the N64 and the GameCube, didn't have great sales. If those were their only systems at those times, Nintendo probably would have not made a lot of money, but they had such a strong, firm grasp on the handheld market. Any losses they made on the console side could easily have been made up on the handheld side. So even if the GameCube and the N64 didn't sell all that great compared to the market-leading consoles at the time, the PlayStation 1 and the PlayStation 2, Nintendo itself was able to remain very profitable. The original Xbox was a gigantic money sink that Microsoft even, I believe, admitted that was basically just their foothold to get into the industry. The 360 was always going to be the system that was really going to set them as their console of main focus. So, like I said, as 3D technology has improved, the cost to make those better graphics has gone up. To the point where if you look at the 7th gen consoles now, when they launched, they were very powerful systems. A PC at the time would have been pretty expensive with the amount of tech you were getting inside of the PlayStation 3 and an Xbox 360 back in 2005 and 2006. And Sony putting Blu-ray in the PlayStation 3 increased the cost all that much more. Those first few years, as much as people like to look at the PlayStation 3 and the 360 as relative successes as far as overall sales these days, even if they didn't sell as much as the Wii, the first few years, especially with the PlayStation 3, Sony was losing a ton of money, and they weren't making the software sales because the software wasn't there, versus the PlayStation 2, where they basically had a monopoly on that generation, given the Xbox and GameCube sold nowhere near as well as the PS2 did, and the PS3 being $600, that's, they struggled the first few years. They lost a ton of money during the last half of the 2000s decade. And the 360, Microsoft cutting corners with the 360, with the Red Ring of Death issue. They lost a ton of money having to replace all those, defective Red Ring 360s because they weren't trying to cut costs and keep the cost of the 360 down. Basically, they had to try to make up all those losses, and that's why I think when you look back at the 7th generation now, it lasted as long as it did. A lot of people with last gen boxes didn't get them maybe until at least halfway through the PS3 and the 360's life, 2009, 2010, especially with the 360. There was a ton of people that got a 360 when the Kinect became popular a few years ago, kind of riding, the coattails of the Wii. And the Wii is kind of another good example of this. That was the first generation of consoles where Nintendo basically decided, okay, we're not going to push the console tech so much anymore. We're going to focus on other aspects of gameplay, innovation, things like that. And that's why the Wii is generally considered a weak, non-HD console, a souped-up GameCube, if you will say. And why the Wii U specifically isn't much more powerful than a PS3 or 360, because Nintendo doesn't want to play that power game anymore because they know how expensive it can be to put out a box that can keep up with the other consoles that are out. So kind of looking at the first half of the 7th gen, like I said, with the PS3 and the 360, and why they were Microsoft and them lost so much money, they wanted to stretch the generation out as much as they could to recoup some of those losses, especially from about 2010 to 2013 when the PlayStation 4 and the Xbox One launched. Those were definitely some of the more profitable times for the PS3 and 360, but it kind of got to the point where, the tech was aging and Sony and Microsoft had to come out with new boxes, but to keep up with the technology curve and to keep up with the, putting out a box that could keep up with a very high-end PC, they just couldn't afford it anymore, especially with how expensive game development has gotten these days. You can't make up software sales. You can't sell hardware at a loss and expect to make up that money with software sales. The cost of game development alone is so expensive. Any money you sell, or any games you sell, will have to be made up, just for the cost of development. So that's why I think when they were looking at putting out the PlayStation 4 and the Xbox One, they said, okay, what is the best box we can put out at a round cost that's going to be decent enough to have a decent jump in power, but that where we're not going to hemorrhage money to the point of, losing a ton of money like we did with the 7th generation of consoles. And that, I think, is the general explanation of why the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One ended up being so weak, which is subjective, admittedly, but compared to where PC tech is now, they're definitely not as powerful as, say, the PlayStation 3 and the 360 were versus PCs of their time when they first launched. And that's why I think going forward, you're not going to have 7, 8, 9 year console generations anymore. You're going to have more of those 5 to 6 year generations where these companies are going to put out the best box they can, probably around that $400 price point. And, you know, basically, this is the box, this is what it's going to be, and this is admittedly as long as consoles remain relevant. You're not going to be able to, you know, put out a console that's $700-800 to cost but sell it at $400. These companies just cannot afford it anymore. And that's why I think the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One in general ended up the way they are. And when we see, you know, the Xbox next, PlayStation 5, probably in about 3 or 4 years, 2018, 2019, 2020, whenever they would launch, you know, hopefully by that point, and like I said, I'm again not going to pretend to be any sort of PC tech expert, but you'll finally able to have consoles at a cheap enough price where they can do 4K gaming relatively well, and why currently the PlayStation 4 and the Xbox One in their current iteration just can't do much better than, you know, 1080p 30 frames per second, if they're even able to do that very well. So that's kind of where I'm coming with this, guys. You know, if anybody wants to give me their impressions and feedback down below, you know, maybe if you got a different explanation of why the systems ended up the way they did, or a different look at the industry in general, by all means, feel free to share it down below in the comments section. Otherwise, that's all I had for today, guys. You guys take it easy, and I'll see you next time.